A reading from the book of Genesis. The child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, playing with her son Isaac. So she said to Abraham, "Cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not inherit along with my son Isaac." The matter was very distressing to Abraham on account of his son, but God said to Abraham, "Do not be distressed because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for it is through Isaac that offspring will be named for you. As for the son of the slave woman, I will make a nation of him also, because he is your offspring." So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered about in the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she cast the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite him, a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot, where she said, "Do not let me look on the death of the child." As she sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice and wept. And God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What troubles you, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Come, lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make a great nation of him." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. She went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy, and he grew up. He lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother got a wife for him from the land of Egypt. This is the word of the Lord.
Father Abraham had two sons. Two sons had Father Abraham. Now, okay, I know what you're thinking. The song says Father Abraham had many sons, and that I am one of them, and so are you, and that's true. But to begin with, there were two sons. The first, Ishmael, the son of an Egyptian slave woman named Hagar, is born out of Abraham and Sarah's understandable doubt that God's promise will be fulfilled. The second, a miracle child, is born to Abraham and Sarah in their old age against all odds. Ishmael is the firstborn, Isaac is the chosen one. In short, it's complicated. In Genesis 21, where we find our story for today, Isaac, the miracle child, has reached the age old enough to wean, and Abraham throws a party to celebrate the occasion. But the celebration doesn't last long for everyone. We learn pretty quickly that there isn't room for everyone at this particular party, or actually in this particular family. Now, I don't know about you, but every time I read this story, I realize how much there is to unpack and to explore within this particular familial saga. There's so much family drama. There are so many fractious relationships. There's confusion about what is God up to, and tensions to be explored around the topic of chosenness and promise. I'm left wanting to understand more about Abraham and Sarah and their actions in this story. And as a father myself, I can't even begin to imagine the tension that Abraham is feeling in this moment. Ishmael is, after all, his firstborn son, not the promised one, but still a treasured child nonetheless. Yet his wife and his God are encouraging and assuring him that sending the boy and his mother out to the desert is in fact the right thing to do. Now, if we get too bogged down here in all of these particular details and relationships, or if we move on too quickly and go right into the rest of the Abraham and Isaac saga, we run the risk of missing some important features of this particular part of the Abrahamic story. Because if we don't stop and give Hagar her due, we miss out on some powerful messages. You see, as Abraham is sending Hagar and Ishmael off into the wilderness, he puts bread and a skin of water on her shoulder along with Ishmael. At this point, Ishmael is a teenager and capable of walking through the wilderness on his own. But still, his mother takes him onto her shoulder and carries him through the wilderness. Her love for her child is stronger than any sense of despair or desolation, even in these bleakest of circumstances. Hagar carries the child, literally shouldering the burden of their current situation as they venture out into the wilderness and into the unknown. Now here's the thing, there may not be much in this story to which we all can personally or directly relate, but we have all had our own experiences of journeying through our own wilderness places, haven't we? And even though a part of what it means to be in the desert is to feel deserted, I'm willing to bet that none of us have ever walked these desert places completely alone. Because there are people along the way, be they parental figures or friends or even strangers, who hoist us up onto their shoulders so that we do not have to face the wilderness by ourselves. And it is often there, in the wilderness, with those companions, that we meet God, who we realize has been there supporting us all along. Now, all this reminds me of a song from the late 1960s, a song by the Hollies called "He Ain't Heavy, He's My Brother." You may know it. It goes something like this: "The road is long, with many a winding turn that leads us to who knows where. But I'm strong enough to carry him. He ain't heavy, he's my brother." These iconic words have symbolized more than just the spirit of that particular song. In fact, there are a number of tales as to where the line, "He ain't heavy, he's my brother," actually originated. One of those stories is from the early 1900s. It comes from when a Catholic priest named Father Edward Flanagan started a home for orphaned and homeless boys called Boys Town. And in 1918, a boy named Howard Loomis was abandoned by his mother at Father Flanagan's home for boys. You see, Howard had polio and wore heavy leg braces. Walking was difficult for him, especially when he had to go up or down the many stairs at the home. So soon, several of the home's older boys were carrying Howard up and down those stairs to help him get wherever he needed to go. And one day, Father Flanagan asked one of those boys who was carrying Howard if doing so was hard. The older boy looked at him and replied, "He ain't heavy, Father. He's my brother." And so that soon became the motto of Boys Town, complete with a statue of a boy on the back of another boy. And all these years later, that motto still symbolizes what the children there learn about the importance of caring for each other and having someone care about them. "He ain't heavy, he's my brother" is an important message beyond Boys Town or a classic oldies song. It's a message for all of us all the time. At some point in our lives, most of us have needed to be carried by someone, either literally or metaphorically. And at some point, we have likely carried someone else. We're human, after all. We stumble, we fall, we need help. And so we look to each other for help when we do. This story of Hagar and Ishmael offers us the chance to stop and to consider the places of wilderness in our own lives and the people who have carried us through those troubled times and places. This story invites us to reflect on certain questions. Who has carried me when I needed help? Who is helping shoulder the burden that I carry now? Where would I be without them? For whom am I doing the very same thing? But this story also asks us to consider any of the people that we have neglected to carry, or any of the wilderness places that we have been implicit in creating for others. What sent Hagar and Ishmael into the wilderness was the fact that they were deemed less than and unworthy to stay in their place. Hagar was, after all, a slave, and Ishmael a child outside of the promise. And so what sent them into the wilderness was a compelling sense by someone else that they didn't belong. Every day, around this nation and around our world, people are sent into all kinds of painful wilderness places because a person or a group of people decides that those other people do not belong. As a society, we continue to find ways to cast out those who don't seem to belong in one place or another. Remember that Holly's song that I mentioned earlier? One of the verses that comes later that continues to stand out to me says, "If I'm laden at all, I'm laden with sadness that everyone's heart isn't filled with gladness of love for one another." You may know the name Phyllis Tribble, notable scholar and theologian. Phyllis Tribble has identified the ways in which Hagar is actually a symbol of the oppressed. Tribble suggests that Hagar in these stories becomes many things to many people. Most especially, Tribble says, all sorts of rejected women find their stories in her. She is the faithful maid exploited, the black woman used by the male and abused by the female of the ruling class, the surrogate mother, the resident alien without legal recourse, the other woman, the runaway youth, the religious fleeing from affliction, the pregnant young woman alone, the expelled wife, the divorced mother with child, the shopping bag lady carrying bread and water, the homeless woman, the indigent relying upon handouts from power structures, the welfare mother, and the self-effacing female whose own identity shrinks in service to other. African American feminists, or womanists, have found in Hagar both a model of their own history as descendants of slaves and survivors of racial oppression, as well as a figure of courage and survival. Scholars like Renita Weems, Wilma Bailey, and Dolores Williams have expressed how Hagar is a victim of ethnic prejudice and economic and social exploitation. They've noted her strength and her survival skills and have shown how her story has been validated as true by suffering black people. Hagar's story reminds us that we, like Ishmael, have been carried through troubled times, and that, like Hagar, we have, in fact, carried others. But it also reminds us, especially in times like we are living through now, that there are times when we have been the ones casting people out or standing by as systems are created to ensure that marginalized people continue to be marginalized. In this country, for far too long, it has been white people standing in the place of privilege, continuing to find ways to keep sending black and brown persons into a variety of deserts and wilderness places. It is long past time, then, that those of us who are white, especially those of us who profess faith in Christ, to begin stepping up, to join with our black brothers and sisters and help shoulder the unjust burden of racism that has been placed upon them. The burden of racism can only be lifted when all of us carry the weight together to repair the breach. As Christians, we have a duty to join the work of changing the current narrative when we begin spending more of our time seeing the problems of others not as their problems, but as our problems. When we begin shouldering one another's burdens and helping all people get from one side, the desert side of the wilderness, to the promised land on the other. And when we start recognizing that there are, in fact, places of wilderness that exist in the world that we have helped create, then fewer and fewer of our brothers and sisters are likely to end up in desert places feeling deserted and alone. Because that's what we are to one another, brothers and sisters and siblings. We are God's family. And to live as God's children faithfully is to step up to help right the perpetuated wrongs against one another and to help eliminate the desert places of oppression that have been constructed over and over again by privilege. We all have burdens to carry. None of us are immune to trouble. Yet some of God's children are unjustly given more burdens to carry. We all have a responsibility then to help carry these burdens with and for one another. And the good news is that none of us carry the weight of these burdens alone. Hagar's story ends with God showing up right when all seems lost to create life anew. In fact, in the Hebrew, the first few syllables of verse 17 are the name Ishmael, meaning God heard. It is actually the only time in the whole story that Ishmael's name appears, as if to emphasize the meaning of the name. God hears. God hears the cries of the outcast and abandoned. When we are in trouble as God's children, when we are in the desert, God hears and responds and points us to new life. God carries us through when we can no longer carry ourselves or carry one another. Whatever we face, we do not face alone. And whatever we carry, we are not meant to carry it alone. Thanks be to God. Amen.